If you want to see what a post-apocalyptic world looks like, you don't need to look at science fiction. You just need to look at us. Our modern society stands on top of a biological catastrophe that pushed humanity to the brink of extinction. In the mid-1300s, a relentless pathogen swept across the continent. The population dropped from 80 million down to roughly 30 million, meaning as much as 60% of Europe's entire population simply vanished. 50 million lives were erased in a single decade. This loss physically dismantled the foundations of the feudal order. The sheer volume of death turned a stagnant landscape of absolute power into a world of abandoned fields and vacant thrones. To understand how a modern, upwardly mobile world emerged from that devastation, we have to look at the rigid empire that had to be cleared away first. In the High Middle Ages, European life was governed by the sprawling socio-economic machine of the feudal system. Land-owning aristocrats held absolute authority over millions of peasant serfs. Under this rigid class structure, a person born to the soil stayed there, working the lord's land for their entire life without any hope of social mobility. By the 1300s, the system was hitting its physical limits. An exploding population forced peasants to overexploit the soil, leaving millions chronically malnourished and highly vulnerable to the slightest disruption in the harvest. While the peasants struggled, the ruling elite grew wealthy through trade. Interconnected routes linked the Mediterranean to deep Asia, moving luxury goods across vast distances and connecting distant populations more closely than ever before. Humanity was wealthy, sprawling, and deeply intertwined. They had no idea that their greatest economic strength, this high-speed trade network, was about to become a fatal biological weakness. In 1346, the Mongol Empire's Golden Horde army surrounded the Genoese trading port of Kaffa. As they hammered the stone fortress walls, a pathogen far more effective than their swords began to decimate their own ranks. The Mongol army turned their dead into weapons. They loaded their catapults with plague-infected corpses and hurled them over the city walls, intentionally infecting the inhabitants trapped inside. 12 Genoese merchant ships managed to flee the infected city, sailing across the Mediterranean Sea to escape the horrific siege. They unknowingly carried the contagion within their cargo holds, hidden among the rats and trade goods. When the fleet reached Messina in late 1347, authorities found the sailors dead or dying. Though officials ordered the ships back out to sea, the bacteria had already moved from the docks into the city. The medieval trade network, designed for profit, now functioned as a delivery system for mass mortality. The bacteria responsible, Yersinia pestis, lived in the guts of fleas carried by black rats. These rats shared the homes and ships of humans, allowing the plague to spread silently through port cities before jumping to people. Once infected, victims developed these repellent buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes in the groin and armpits that oozed blood and pus. High fever and black sores followed. Death usually arrived within 72 hours. Medieval medicine offered no defense. Physicians, unaware of microscopic germs, blamed the plague on miasma, poisonous air, or the alignment of the stars, leaving them helpless to treat or prevent the infection. Terrified masses looked to the supernatural for an explanation. In many cities, large groups of flagellants marched in public processions, whipping themselves to seek forgiveness for the sins they believed had triggered God's wrath. Social order broke down. Priests refused last rites, doctors fled their patients, and families abandoned their sick loved ones in a desperate attempt to save themselves. The civilization fractured because it lacked the tools to even comprehend the enemy it was fighting. Ghost towns and unburied bodies became the new visual reality of Europe. As this manuscript shows, the sheer volume of the dead forced authorities to stack wooden coffins into crowded mass graves. This modern excavation site reveals the scale of those emergency measures. Archaeologists regularly find these dense rows of burial pits beneath major European cities, confirming the massive mortality recorded in medieval texts. Death ignored the strict feudal hierarchy. As this fresco illustrates, macabre skeletons led away queens and religious figures just as indiscriminately as the poorest serfs. The weight of 50 million corpses pulled the feudal empire apart. Without a living population to tax, farm, or govern, the rigid hierarchies of the Middle Ages simply dissolved into the soil. In the quiet aftermath of the plague, the survivors found themselves in a transformed world. The deaths of millions of peasants had created a massive, unprecedented shortage of labor. This scarcity gave the working class immense leverage. As the labor population dropped, it triggered a spike in real wages, forcing landowners to pay more, while aristocratic land rents collapsed. Land became abundant for those who remained. Large aristocratic estates began to fracture, redistributing property to a broader base of survivors, whose diets improved from basic grains to meat and dairy. This surge in peasant purchasing power drove up the demand for luxury goods, textiles, and iron. To meet this demand, merchants and nations began financing the expeditions that would eventually push European ships across the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean. The path to the present began with the total demographic collapse of the 14th century. We are the descendants of those resilient survivors who used that newfound leverage to build the modern world. If you want to witness more stories of the rise and fall of power, subscribe and follow to Empire Snapshots.